Hero, in today's episode, I correct a grave injustice, and I answer some of the hardest questions I have ever been asked in public in my life. Questions like these.
There's all this talk about this Islamic State, and everybody's really up in arms, like, what is this Islamic State? But interestingly, I feel like there hasn't been much discussion regarding the concept of a Jewish state. I would just be curious to understand that a little bit more, whether or not the concept of a Jewish state, is that something that is inherent in Judaism, or is that something more like a political movement that has Jewish overtones, so to speak?
In the Jewish scriptures, there are a large number of prophecies about the Messiah, who he would be, what he would do, where he would be born, etc. Over 40 of them are fulfilled by Jesus and only Jesus. How do you deal with or explain away Jesus as the fulfillment of these prophecies? What makes Judaism reject them as your promised Messiah?
What do you believe the role of God today is in our society?
You can hear my answers, and more importantly, the best way to ask and answer hard questions in your life, right after this bass.
Welcome to the Jewcurious Show, where learning about Judaism and getting to know Jewish people can help you live a life of meaning, joy, human connection, and personal growth. And now your host, Rabbi John Carrier.
Thank you, Ron, for that great introduction. Thank you, Joey, and your friends in the Hadar Ensemble for that music. And thank you, Hero, for once again joining me for the Jewcurious Show. If you're not once again joining me, but you're here for the first time, I'd like you to consider subscribing to this show. Before you settle in, before you put your car in drive on your commute, before you start walking the dog or start washing the dishes, and put your smartphone in your pocket to do whatever you're doing hands-free, I'd like you to use your hands to press the subscribe button on the podcasting platform of your choice. That way, if you enjoy this episode, you'll get access to all the other episodes that we've had so far, and you will automatically be able to download each new episode that comes out every week. But if you are once again joining us, if you're coming back for more, I'd like you to consider leaving a review of this show on iTunes. Something made you come back, and for some reason you and I are learning together again. I'd like to hear how we're doing. I'd like to hear how you feel about this show. I'd like you to let other people know how you feel about this show. That way, if it's for them, they can find it more easily and hear what you have to say. So take care of subscribing, take care of leaving a review, and then put the phone in your pocket, put your car into drive, put the leash on the dog, and settle in. Because today's show is a little different. First, I'm going to correct a grave injustice. The injustice is this. I get all sorts of hard questions from people about Judaism and about the Jewish people, and then I punt those questions by asking them to my guests. Now, from this, we've gotten some amazing insight from some amazing teachers. At least I think so, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. But this is episode number 9. We're 9 episodes in, and I have managed to avoid all these hard questions. But not today. Today, the tables are turned. Today, justice is done. Because today you're going to hear a recording of a very special event I had the honor and pleasure of taking part in, and that is an interfaith forum put on by the Burbank Human Relations Council. Now, this interfaith forum was called A Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim in Conversation. And you have 2 guesses to determine which one of those I was, but I think it'll only take you one. So I was the Jew. Spoiler alert. And what you'll hear sounds like a very easy conversation among 3 friends. But this event was months in the planning, was over a year in the making, and I'm actually super duper proud of what we were able to put together. And in this event, my friends Father Jose Poch, an ordained Anglican priest and the leader of St. David's Anglican Church in Burbank, and Brother Daniel Amin Coleman, who is a prominent member of the Muslim community here in Burbank and in Los Angeles in general. These two tzaddikim, these two saints in my book, and I sat together and asked each other the hardest questions we could think of about each other's faith. And what's important is we didn't do this sort of like standing up on behalf of our faith. Like, I'm not getting up there and saying, this is what Judaism teaches, right? If you've listened to the show before, you know that no true statement ever started with Judaism says this and only this about X. We have lots of different opinions, and I found that that's true about my Christian brother and my Muslim brother as well. We decided we were just going to be three dudes who each have strong faith in a particular area, asking each other honest questions as friends, and speaking from the heart on our own behalf about our own belief and not assigning that belief to anybody else. And all this was done with tremendous help and work and love on behalf of the Burbank Human Relations Council. We also had the support and the leadership and the vision of the offices of elected officials here in Burbank, various leaders of the Burbank community. And rather than list all of them and maybe forget some of them, unfortunately, I'm just going to leave a link in the show notes to an article about this event. And you could read more about it on your own time, people. But just know that so many people helped out to make this event happen, to make it, I think, an unqualified success. But more importantly, the challenge of the questions that we put to each other and the ability that we had to answer them honestly and with open hearts is based on the fact that these two gentlemen and I had spent the last year building up a relationship. We had coffee or breakfast together on a monthly basis. We got to know each other's backstory, how we came to be the people of faith that we are today, what struggles we've had along the way with that, what changes in direction we've taken along the way with that. If you know my story, you know there's been a lot of struggles and a lot of change in direction, but I've learned I'm certainly not alone in that. And once we got to know each other, then we were able to ask hard questions in a loving way, in a context of trust and mutual respect. But I have to say, over the course of that year of getting to know these two guys, neither of them asked me questions as hard as they asked me on this day. And I like to think I gave as good as I got. I asked them some hard questions as well. And not to leave you in too much suspense, but to tease you a little bit for what's coming so that you'll stay tuned for this important conversation. The questions that I was asked, the hardest questions that I was asked was A, what's the justification for a Jewish state in the modern state of Israel? And B, why don't Jews believe that Jesus is the Messiah that we speak about in our own texts? I've been asked both these questions multiple times. I've answered them from the heart on kind of an individual one-on-one basis, but never in such a public forum. And there were about 100 attendees there, plus the volunteers and staff for the event, plus the press. And so everybody out there took a great risk, spoke from the heart. I know I certainly did. And I want to share that with you in this episode today. I will say before we get into this, I have to apologize a little bit in advance for the sound quality. This was recorded from a digital recorder in a big concrete room with over 100, probably more like 110, 120 people in there. But listen closely anyway, because I think what comes out is important. Real quick, before we get started, I just wanted to let you know how pleased I am with the 31-day Fall Jewish Holiday Learning Challenge that is going on right now. I've talked about that over the last couple of episodes. Right now, as of this recording, we've gotten over 60 people involved in this learning challenge. I couldn't be more impressed with you who are doing it. I couldn't be more pleased that this is happening. I've even added a resource that maybe I didn't talk about before. If you sign up for this challenge, and there is a link at the very end of the show notes. The show notes, by the way, today are at jewcurious.show/episode 9. Go there and you'll see a big gold button on that page. But if you don't have the patience to read all of that, and maybe you don't see color, a lot of people don't, you can just go to jewcurious.show/challenge. And if you go to that link, you'll see all about it. And what you'll see is that by signing up for this challenge, immediately you'll be able to download from an email this year's edition of my annual holiday guide. This goes over all the major Jewish holidays of the Jewish calendar in the coming year, explains what they're all about, where they come from, how they're celebrated, and it has the correct dates on the secular or Gregorian calendar, the calendar you might have on your desk or in your phone, what the specific dates are for those in the coming year. You get that right away. Then you get emails with links to all 31 of the videos about the fall holidays of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, all the preparation leading up to them, a little bit of a lesson on how the Jewish calendar works that explains why the holidays seem to be on a different day every year, and then detailed instruction about each of the holy days, where they come from, how they're celebrated, what prayers are involved, what foods are involved, how to make sure you have a place to go to worship. And I'm doing this every day in the month of August. We're a few days in, but there's several days to go. Certainly not too late to join. And if you join this challenge before the end of August, you'll be entered to win one of 3 sets of books that I'm giving out. I call this a starter Jewish library. It has a book about the holidays. It has a book about Jewish prayer. It has a book about Jewish thought, or several actually. And don't forget, some recipes. There's a cookbook in there as well. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in learning more about the holidays, not just for their own sake, but so that you can have a better understanding of what they are. And if you have a better understanding, you actually appreciate the experience more. It's a more meaningful experience for you. And so that you can actually come away from this year's holiday with a greater experience of meaning and joy and connection with all the people who are there. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and go to jewcurious.show/challenge, find out more, sign up. I'm excited to continue learning with you. But enough about that. I really want to get into today's show so that we can correct this injustice of me dodging hard questions, and so that you can hear what I have to say about some of the most important and controversial questions that I get asked. I will say before we get into this, I have to apologize a little bit in advance for the sound quality. This was recorded from a digital recorder in a big concrete room with over 100, probably more like 110, 120 people in there. But listen closely anyway, because I think what comes out is important. But also make sure that you're attuned to the message that the only way that we were able to ask these questions and answer these sincerely is because me and the other people there had spent time building up trust, building up a relationship, getting to know each other, how human each other is, how much we have in common as people of faith, as people who share Burbank and all the issues that come with that. If you're able to see somebody as another human being sitting across the table from you and not just a representative of a class or a category, but as we learned from Rabbi Artson, learn to dispense with those categories and see the human being in front of you, then you are really able to learn with and from somebody. That's what I did on this day, and that's what I want to share with you right now.
Welcome to the Burbank Human Relations Council presentation of the Burbank Interfaith Forum, a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim in conversation. My name is David Meyerhoff. I am the founder and the chairperson of the Burbank Interfaith Forum. I'm also on the board of the Burbank Human Relations Council. I would like to dedicate this event to a very special person, Sylvia Sutton. Sylvia Sutton suffered a major stroke and is in hospice for her remaining days. She was the driving force in the continued successes of the Days of Remembrance, the Holocaust speakers for the Burbank School District, and was key in sustaining the Burbank Human Relations Council through her extraordinary leadership and more than 4 decades of unwavering commitment. Over the past 40 years, she has been a champion of peace, women's rights, civil rights, and human rights in our city. It is in her spirit of cooperation, tolerance, and humanity that we dedicate this program. 55% of the world's population, or 4 billion people, are Christians, Muslims, or Jews. We must learn about each other, work with each other, respect one another, or the result will be catastrophic. This forum started in June 2017 after the Days of Remembrance at Temple Emmanuel in Burbank. I approached Rabbi John Carrier from Temple Emmanuel, Father Jose Koch from St. David's Anglican Church, and Brother Daniel Coleman from the Burbank Islamic Center and Canoga Park Mosque about starting a dialogue among those three religions. They were very agreeable, and the Burbank Interfaith Forum began. Additional members include Marcia Ramos, Mike Chapman from the Burbank Human Relations Council, Tanya Olson from St. David's Anglican Church, Blake Dellinger from Assemblymember Maura Friedman's office, and Arda Chakanian from Senator Anthony Portantino's office. We have been meeting monthly at St. David's Anglican Church. Interfaith learning teaches us the power of language and brings attention to generalizations. While there are many doctrines in major religions around the world that claim to be the one and only path, there are also aspects to those same religions that encourage peace, cooperation, and compassion. Understanding each other and having a willingness to work among each other, regardless of what we believe, is a skill that could have unimaginable power in regards to the fate of humanity. Now, you have in your program the guiding principles of our Interfaith Forum, and this is the preface to our guiding principles. Religions and beliefs are important forces in the lives of individuals and communities, and therefore have great significance for society as a whole. Understanding these convictions is necessary if people are to understand one another in our diverse society, and also if they are to appreciate the significance of the rights that protect them. Learning about religions and beliefs other than one's own contributes in forming and developing self-understanding, including a deeper appreciation of one's own religion or belief. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your unbelievable volunteerism.
Oh, thank you.
So with that, I would like to do some introductions of some community leaders that have joined us here this afternoon. First, I'd like to acknowledge Burbank Mayor Emily Gabel-Luddy, City Manager Ron Davis, School Board President Dr. Roberta Redmond, and representing the 43rd Assembly District and member of the Forum Committee, Blake Dillinger. We also have Arda Chakanian, who is representing Senator Anthony Portantino and volunteering. And although she was acknowledged, I want to introduce her one more time, a special guest, Sister Regina Palomera, who's a Cabrini sister. And this is where she went to school, but it's where the Cabrini Order also did a lot of work, hospital and education. So she's right there. So many community leaders in the room. I can't acknowledge you all, but thank you all for joining us and for supporting this important event. So a Muslim, a Christian, and Jew, we will now witness a conversation between three extraordinary faith leaders. And I've had the pleasure to meet with them over the past year. After the conversation between them, you will all have an opportunity to ask some questions. You were all given an index card like this when you checked in. And if you don't have one and need one, raise your hand and someone will get one to you. So there's someone that needs one right there. Please submit your questions and hand it into, raise your hand, George, Arda, and Melanie. And they'll be standing up and looking for some. Hand your questions into them as we as we complete the panel discussion. And with that, I would like to tell you a little about the unique backgrounds of these extraordinary faith representatives. I think you will learn some insights, perspectives, and values that they all share. They're unique, yet I think they'll find commonalities. So with that, let me begin with Daniel Amin Coleman, who was raised in a unique household where his Christian mother and Jewish father had both converted to Buddhism before he was even born. Given his upbringing, he had exposure to many different faiths and cultures. At the age of 24, he became a Muslim after studying with the Shaykh, did I say? Sheikh, see, I have lots to learn, from Jerusalem, who would travel to the United States to share the spiritual message of Islam as a path devoted to mercy and peace. He has a master's degree in peacemaking from the University of Spiritual Healing and Sufism. He currently lives in Canoga Park with his wife and son, and he deeply enjoys his friendship and dialogues with Rabbi Carrier and Reverend Poach. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us. And now, a little bit, I'm sure there's more to tell, a little bit about Father Jose Poach. He was born in Cuba and immigrated to the United States in 1968. He has been an Anglican priest for 35 years. He has been the senior pastor of St. David's Anglican Church for the last 27 years. He is married. He has 2 grown daughters and 4 grandchildren, with another one on the way. He's happy to be a part of this trialogue and to be in relationship with both Rabbi John Carrier and Daniel Coleman. He has learned a lot from these dialogues and looks forward to continue to meet together with Rabbi John and Daniel. Rabbi John Carrier is a teacher of Jewish wisdom and traditions who has served as a spiritual leader of Burbank Temple Emmanuel since his ordination in 2014. Rabbi Carrier converted to Judaism as an adult 18 years ago, after being raised in a Protestant Christian family. However, since his father was a 3rd-generation Southern Baptist minister, John believes he's back in the family business. Today, he teaches and preaches in synagogues, on YouTube, in podcasts, and in his recent book titled The Promised Life. John lives in Burbank with his wife and 2 daughters and has 2 grown sons, who almost only talk to him through text messages. He is thankful to participate in this important endeavor. So with that, I turn it over to these 3 good men.
So if I may, we were trying to decide who would go first. And religious conflict ensued. So, Marcia, if you will, I'd like to give you a couple of more trying responsibilities today.
Sure.
One is your reputation as a peacemaker, picking which one of us will go first. And the other, and I shared this with Father Poach a minute ago, it's hard as a rabbi to talk for only 5 minutes on one subject. So if you could maybe, I don't know, clear your throat or tap your foot if we go a little bit too long, we'd be much obliged.
Will do.
Okay.
So with that, I am going to pick Daniel Coleman.
Okay, so I asked first? I'm asking. So, thank you so much. All right, so my question for Rabbi Carrier. Recently, there's been a lot of concern and media attention regarding, this group ISIS, which is, a horrible, twisting of our Islamic faith representation. But because of that, there's all this talk about this Islamic State, and everybody's really up in arms, like, what is this Islamic State? But interestingly, I feel like there hasn't been much discussion regarding the concept of a Jewish state. Israel, as we know, is a Jewish state. And so I think I would just be curious to understand that a little bit more, whether or not the concept of a Jewish state, is that something that is inherent in Judaism, or is that something more like a political movement that has Jewish overtones, so to speak?
That's an excellent question. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to it. I can't speak to the interests or motivations of the creation of an Islamic State by comparison, because I'm not invited to any of those meetings. But what I hope I can do is give you some background into the interest of having a Jewish state in our sort of biblical homeland, and where that came from, and what we're doing with it right now. So where it came from, I mentioned two dates. One is 1894, and one is 1948. They're all the same numbers. We've had this longing to be in our land as a part of our scripture since we've had scripture. The whole of the beginning of the Torah is the relationship between God and our father Abraham, and this notion that Abraham would have a place of his own from which to bless the whole world. And then we spend the rest of the book trying to get back there through Deuteronomy. And at various places we've been exiled from our homeland, and the poetry in the Psalms and in the prophets has had this sense of longing to return to our land, and that's always been with us, but we haven't had a self-governing presence in the land in over 2,000 years until very recently. And where that got started, this goes to the question whether this is kind of a religious motivation or a political motivation. The answer is yes. And that became, and I spoke to the religious longing, but the political longing started really to gather steam in 1894. There was this trial in France called the Dreyfus Affair, where the background in Europe was this movement of nationalism. And it's hard to imagine, but the states of France and Germany and Italy as they are today is largely a 19th century accomplishment. And that was this whole wave of nationalism that was sweeping through Europe, where people said, we need to have a consolidated state where we can feel comfortable and safe. And in France, that began in, I think, 1792 or something with the French Revolution. And then, but later on, there was an officer named Dreyfus who was treated very unfairly in a trial, ostensibly because he was Jewish. And there was a young reporter for a Viennese newspaper named Theodor Herzl who was covering this. And he decided at that moment that for the Jewish people to be really safe in the world, in a world where we had been either kicked out of, barred from, murdered, or forcibly assimilated in every country that we've lived in throughout our history, that we really needed a place of our own to be safe. And that started the first World Zionist Congress, and people started to get together to make this a reality. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it would be Israel. We just wanted a place to call our own. Some of the candidates were like Uganda and Paraguay. But Israel had a pretty strong draw. And then in 1948, when the world was first beginning to understand the horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, we had unprecedented sympathy for a mission that we had longed for some would say politically 100 years, but spiritually 2,000 more. And the United Nations recognized Israel as a country. And so since that time, we've been working on a very delicate balancing act of having a state that is both that is a refuge for Jewish people all over the world, as a safe harbor of last resort, because we needed it before. But also being a Jewish state, at the same time being a democratic state. And sometimes those two things conflict with each other. And we see that borne out now, that there's no democratic state that speaks with one voice. And we have our same struggles with fundamentalist movements within religions, and we have the same struggles with self-determination and self-defense. And where we see conflict, it reminds me of the United States of America, where Israel is 70 years old. When the U.S. was 70 years old, we looked a little rough too. In fact, we were on the eve of civil war. And so I think for having created a state, for having the hard job of self-defense, we're doing okay, but we always have room to grow. And to speak to the idea of a religious state, I asked a colleague of mine, is Judaism a religion or is Judaism a race? Because that goes to this idea of a religiously based state for diverse people. And he said, I prefer to think of us as a family. Right? Because a family is something you can be born into, or adopted into, or converted into, or divorced out of. And that family has its traditions, and that family sometimes has a singular religion. Some people are better at it than others, and some people are more serious about it than others. But at the end of the day, we feel strongly that history requires that we have a place of our own, and we constantly strive to make that place democratic and safe, and even in our founding documents, have freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and freedom for all of its citizens to fully participate.
Okay, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you. I would answer your question.
That was awesome. So I go again, right?
Right.
Okay. All right, Rabbi Jose. As you know, one of the central differences between the Islamic faith and the Christian faith centers around the idea of the divinity of Jesus Christ. Peace be upon him. Muslims believe that Christ was the Messiah, and we also believe that he was born from an immaculate conception. But we don't believe that he claimed to be God himself, but rather that he was a prophet of God. From an Islamic viewpoint, the Christians had strayed from the true tenets of monotheism with the concept of the Trinity, which now made God into three instead of one. We also believe that it's possible that some of these distinctions in our traditions may have arisen in the time period from when Christ was there to, I believe, the 4th century was when the oldest Greek Bible exists. And that potentially, as we know, Jesus, peace be upon him, must have spoken Hebrew or Aramaic, but we don't have really any source documents in that, at least, complete versions of the Bible in those languages. So we think that perhaps there is potential for mistranslations or misinterpretations of Scripture. So that being said, my question is that, however, in the Bible that exists today, there appears to be statements referring to Jesus Christ that seem to indicate that perhaps he is not equal to God. So I'll just read you a couple statements and then be curious to hear how Christians understand these statements. If that's okay. So, for example, in Matthew 24:36, there's a quote here. It says, "No one knows about the day or hour, not even the Son, but the Father only." So this is Jesus, peace be upon him, speaking. In other words, it seems to indicate that he doesn't know when the hour will come, but that the Father will. Mark 10:18 says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." And in John 14:28, it says, "The Father is greater than I." Can you explain how Christians understand those particular verses in light of the understanding of Jesus being God himself?
Thank you, brother. Number one, it's a pleasure to be with both of you. Now, his question is multi-layered, so maybe more than 5 minutes.
The rabbi has 7.
Yeah.
case, one of the things that is extremely important for everyone here to understand, even before I try and answer the question, is that the way we started from our first meeting is we just started getting to know each other. We just spent as much time as necessary getting to tell our stories, getting to trust each other, getting to love one another. And it is in that context of trusting each other and loving each other that we have now begun to ask perhaps tougher questions than we did at the beginning. At the beginning, we were just careful not to offend or anything, and we still are very, very careful not to offend. And so we check with each other all the time to make sure that we're not offending. However, we're beginning to ponder deeper some of our differences, and so we certainly want you to understand that I trust these men, and I invite them to ask me the toughest questions they can find about my faith, because I'm not offended by them, and I actually want to share with them what we believe. So that's just for everyone to know to the level that we have come so far. In answer to your question, brother, first of all, Jesus never ever claimed to be a prophet. He certainly had prophetic gifts, and he certainly prophesied many times, such as prophesying things about the end of time, prophesying a number of things all through Scripture. But never, ever in Scripture, Jesus refers to himself as a prophet. He refers himself as the Son of God. Repeatedly, he, in all of the Gospels, which tell us the stories of Jesus and the words of Jesus, he refers to himself as the Son of God, and he refers to God as his Father. And he claims to have come from his Father and to return to his Father, and that his Father is in him and he's in his Father. That is in John also, one of the passages that you quoted. In some of the Gospels, he also refers to himself, and these are the only two titles he uses pretty much. The Christ, he calls himself the Christ or the Messiah. He calls himself the Son of God, and he calls himself the Son of Man. That kind of goes along with Daniel and Jeremiah, and where a figure like the Son of Man appears in both of those books. As far as the Trinity is concerned, which is something that is important, we never, ever, ever, at any time, try and destroy or say that God is not one. In fact, because our roots are in Judaism, we hold to the Shema, and we hold to the fact that God is one. And there is no Christian ever that will tell you that God is not one, that it is three gods. Anything like that is heretical in our point of view. So we never destroy the oneness of God. We do come to understand from the revelations that we have received in the Gospels and in Jesus, that Jesus is more than a prophet, that Jesus is actually divine. In reference to your question about Jesus speaking Aramaic and Hebrew, correct. That's probably what a lot of the people of the time in Jerusalem spoke, Hebrew and Aramaic. Some of the disciples seem to have spoken Greek. In fact, Philip is a Greek name. And some of them may have spoken Greek. Greek was the Koine Greek, for common Greek as it was called, was the language of the day, the business language of the day, like English is now. And so what we need to understand as far as the language is we need to understand that the four Gospels, possibly the Gospel of Matthew, which is the more Jewish of all of the Gospels, some believe that it may have been written in Hebrew to begin with, And the audience for Matthew's gospel is the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And so he spends a lot of time, and the emphasis of the Gospel of Matthew is to show the Jewish people that Jesus fulfills all, if not most, of the prophecies in the Old Covenant about who the Messiah would be. And so that's the emphasis of Matthew. The emphasis of Mark and Luke is more on a Greek audience, so probably those were written in Greek. John, on the other hand, which is one of the things you quoted, John was probably the closest disciple to Jesus. He was the youngest. He was probably the more intimate with Jesus than all the other disciples. In fact, he was the only one at the cross when Jesus died. He was the only one who died of old age rather than a martyr. All the other disciples died for what they believed and what they claimed they had seen, the resurrection of Jesus, and they were willing to die. John lived into old age and died as an old man. And it is precisely John that presents Jesus as divine and as God more than any of the other Gospels, even though we find all the Gospels presenting him as divine. It is John more than anyone else, and it's one of the passages you quoted that presents Jesus as God. For example, just to give you a couple of illustrations, the very beginning of the Gospel of John begins with the idea that in the beginning, kind of quoting Genesis 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the way the Greeks understood the universal mind or God. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And nothing that has ever been created was created without the Word, without the Logos. And then a few verses later, it says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us as of the only begotten Son of the Father. And so John begins by clearly stating the eternity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Almost the end of the Gospel of John, when one of his disciples named Thomas first hears the news that Jesus has resurrected from the dead, and the disciples, the others, have seen him, he at first says, no, unless I see him, unless I touch him, I'm not going to believe. It's too big a thing to believe just like that. And then Jesus appears to him just 8 days later, and Thomas makes the statement, my Lord and my God. Jesus doesn't say, oh, no, don't call me God. Jesus accepts the divine name, and he actually says, Thomas, do you believe because you see? Blessed are those who will believe without seeing. So here you have the beginning of the Gospel of John declaring that Jesus is God, the end of the Gospel of John declaring that he is God, and then in the middle, John unpacks what it means to be that Jesus is God. Jesus has 7 statements where he uses the I am, the Jewish I am, that is the name of God given to Moses in the burning bush. And he makes statements like, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the truth, the life. He makes all of these statements where he clearly uses the tetragrammaton in a way, or in the Greek form of the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters of the name of God. And then he makes also a statement which is kind of strange. He says, before Abraham was, I am. There are clear references all through the Gospel of John that Jesus is divine, that Jesus is God, that Jesus did claim to be God, not only Messiah, but all through John we find that. And one of the passages that you actually quote, which is very interesting, and by the way, these are things that you and I are going to have to talk even more, because I want to know more. and I want you to know more. But that statement that the Father is greater than I, in the Divine Trinity, as we understand it, there is one God in essence. They share the same divinity, but they are distinct from each other. For example, just a very quick analogy, and all analogies fall apart. The three of us here.
It's got to be quick.
Okay, the three of us here, we share the same essence, which is humanity. And yet the three of us are completely different from one another. In the Trinity, the way we understand it is that there is one essence, divinity, one thing that unites all of them, that they are one God, but they are distinct one from another within the Godhead, within the economy of what it means to be God. And in that particular reference, what it means is that there is the Father, there is the Son, and in that sense, the Father is greater than the Son, just like in my home. It's not that we are different, it's not that I am better, it's not that I'm not equal with my girls, but I am the Father. And so the Father has a certain responsibility and a certain position in the family. And it would be impossible to think that that passage, based on everything I have said, that passage would deny the divinity of Jesus. So that passage actually affirms the role that they have within each other, but they share the same, call it the same DNA. It's a bad word to actually apply to God, but it's the same essence, but all three of them are different one from the other. But we do hold to the unity of God and the uniqueness of God, although three different persons. This is just the beginning of you and I talking some more.
Rabbi Carrier, can you ask the next question?
Okay. So I just want to echo one thing that Father Court said briefly, and I told you this in the beginning, that it is a real testament to the importance of the work and the work that we've done as friends, that we're now able to ask probably the hardest questions there are between us at this point, in public too. So my first question is for my brother Daniel. It's my understanding from the research of the Pew Institute and elsewhere that moderate expressions of religious belonging are now on the decline. Within the Jewish community that I can speak to, we are seeing an increase in the proportion of our people who either adopt more fundamentalist practices and communities, or else drop out of religious practice and identification with their Jewishness altogether. I've heard from Christian colleagues that the same is happening in some of their communities. Are you seeing that in Islam as well? And if so, what do you think is being lost in your communities by this trend? And if there's a desire to stop it, what do you think can be done?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much for asking it. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not an Islamic scholar, nor am I an imam, but I'm a Muslim convert, so I can speak from my own perspective. And interestingly, I would say that obviously Islamic extremism is what gets most of the attention these days in headlines, because obviously these things are very concerning to people and they look very scary. But I actually was doing some research based on the question you sent me, and I was read what the Pew Research Institute had said about Muslims in America and Muslims worldwide in general. And what they've seen is that since September 11th, that extremism is actually not on the rise. That they said that perhaps 3% of the Muslim population supports extremism, which is really not that much. But we do have 1.7 billion people, so the 3% is still a decent number that we want to pay attention to. But it's not as much as people think. So unfortunately, it's the most sensational aspect of the news. So that gets the headlines. Now, to answer your question, I actually think, in a way, that there's a move towards the middle, because what's happening is extremism is forcing Muslims to actually really stand up and identify what they believe and where they stand on these issues. And so it's actually forcing Muslims to kind of come and actually really be more vocal about their faith and to really help identify, who they are and what they stand for. So I think actually there's been a move towards the middle because nobody wants to be affiliated with extremism. The extremism hurts the Muslims more than it hurts anybody else, actually. So it's, I think, it's actually the only positive thing you could say that has come of these horrible acts is that it's really forced the Muslim community to stand up. Now, interestingly, I remember during the horrific shooting was in San Bernardino or whatever, I asked a friend, I said, what's going on? Like, where are the Muslims, in terms of their outreach, And I found out later that there was actually a candlelight vigil that the local Muslim community was hosting, so there were actually a lot of efforts and stuff. But what he had explained to me is you have to keep in mind, it's hard just to compare faiths because there's so many other segments or factors to take into consideration. Largely in the Muslim community is the immigrant sector. So you have to keep in mind that a lot of Muslims in this country are immigrants. And what he was explaining to me, he's the son of an immigrant, and he's saying that, the immigrant mentality is actually to assimilate. You don't want to stick out. You want to blend in. And they're very happy to be in America. They're very grateful for all the blessings that they can have in America, And, but because of that, they don't want to be activists. They don't want to be on the front lines, like drawing attention. They want to just blend in and just lay low and just be normal people. So now what you're seeing, though, is the next generation of Muslims that are now saying, like, hey, there's this void here that needs to be filled, and we need to do. So now you'll see a lot of the youth are kind of filling that gap, so to speak.
That's excellent. I really appreciate that answer, and I think we share stories about immigrant phases, and the Jewish community is a little more settled than it was before, which 1,500 years ago, there was that same sort of push toward the middle, if you will. But I do know within our own, not in Burbank, but in the national Jewish community, when there was desecration of the cemetery, I know who was there to help us put those heavy stones back up, and it was our Muslim brothers and sisters. So I wanted to call that out. Now, if I may, I want to ask some questions to my friend, Father Jose Poach.
I haven't gotten to ask any question. then I will end with asking both of you.
Yes.
Exactly.
Now, I'll say personally, one of the most influential books on my own spiritual development wasn't a Jewish book. It was actually Leo Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You, which I believe the title is a quote from Luke, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And it comes from a Christian source and perspective. It planted, even though it's from that source, it planted within me the notion that my relationship with God and my duty to God transcends earthly relationships and obligations. It's been cited as a favorite text both of the Mahatma Gandhi as well as Martin Luther King in their development of ideas of nonviolent activity and nonviolent resistance to evil, based on Tolstoy's view of pacifism inherent in Christ's teachings. What I've never understood is violence committed ostensibly in the name of Christ, who taught us to turn the other cheek, rather than an earlier teaching of take an eye for an eye. My question is, how can a practicing Christian serve in the military and combat role, knowing they might be ordered or be required in self-defense or the defense of others to commit violence?
Okay, thank you. Good question. Excellent question. And I want to say that war in any way and from any place or any people against another is not right or in line with Christian teaching. War, violence, abuse, degradation of anyone or any people or any race for that matter is not the Christian way. It is not. Unfortunately, it has happened, and I agree. There are many times and many cases that can be quoted and no denying it. And unfortunately, it not only happens between countries and peoples, it happens between just individuals, period, in any neighborhood. And and that is sad. And not everyone that may call themselves Christians are actually Christians or living by the rule of Christ. But you are correct that Jesus taught nonviolence. In fact, I think Jesus taught more than nonviolence. I think he taught in many ways no retaliation at all from anyone that brings you violence. Especially in the Sermon on the Mount, which you kind of alluded to, Jesus goes beyond just nonviolence. He says no retaliation. If someone wants you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. If somebody strikes you in the cheek, give him another. If somebody takes your tunic, give him everything. Don't retaliate. That is what our Lord has taught. War is never good. It is never good at all, even at times when it may seem necessary. When someone may attack you or attack your family or attack your nation. War may be at times necessary for defense. But it doesn't matter how it happens or how it is never good. It never ends in good. And it hurts sometimes more people than anyone else. The way of Christ, the teachings of Christ is peace, is unity, is forgiveness. In fact, Jesus is the one that is retaliated against himself and gets himself crucified for no good reason, really, than doing good. And he yet, from the cross, he cries out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That is really the way of Christ. When it comes to war and understanding of that Christians have, we kind of have to go to what St. Augustine wrote about, probably in the 5th or 6th century, during the time that Rome was beginning to fall apart and being attacked by all sorts of nations around them. St. Augustine wrote a bit extensive on the issue of what he called the theory of just war. And he set down certain principles on just war. And there were 2 things in particular that he addressed. And one was what he called the right to go to war, and the second was the right conduct during war. And these are 4 things that he said as to when to go to war or the right to go to war. He spoke of just authority. Is it legal? Has it been discussed? Is it a legal declaration of war versus just one man deciding to war against another? Is this a legitimate war? Second, just cause. For example, he spoke about a war should be in order to wrong or to right a wrong that has been committed. A country can go to war if a wrong has been committed and the intent of the war is to right the wrong that has been committed, such as a big, powerful nation attacking a small nation, or a people, ethnically attacking, and you know about that, and there's not a bigger supporter of Israel, and what took us to World War II had a lot to do with what was happening with the Holocaust and all the other stuff that was going on. And the intent was to right a wrong that had been done. And in a case like that, you can go to war. There's also what he called the right intention. Is the response proportional to the cause? Is the response of war proportional to the cause? It is limited to righting the wrong and no more than that. Not taking somebody's land, not just righting something that was wrong. And the last thing he kind of said on that idea was the idea of the war should be a last resort. Everything else should have been tried, political, conversations, whatever, had to be tried and found that war is the only left alternative. He also spoke about the moral conduct in war. And he said that the moral conduct when you go to war, it needs to be in proportionality and not do more than what has been done to you, or not do more and abuse more, or take advantage of your power in order to further damage some people and so on. So it needs to be in proportion. It also needs to not deal with discrimination in the sense that you can't go to war and attack non-combatants. There are innocent people that get killed constantly in many of the wars that we have experienced, which are non-combatant. And St. Augustine was very careful to delineate that when you go to war against the country, you go to war and you fight other soldiers that also are as armed as you are, but you do not do damage to innocent people, to non-combatants, to non-military people, etc. And then lastly, he spoke about the responsibility. And he said that a country really is not responsible for damage done by somebody who goes beyond these rules, somebody that goes crazy, somebody that has the opportunity to, for example, take on a prisoner and ends up actually shooting him, even though the person is no longer armed. So whenever we look at the issue of war from a Christian perspective, I would say to you that war, killing, hurting others is not the way of Christ. But sometimes war may be necessary in order to right a wrong, but how that war is conducted, it's imperative that it be done in a manner that brings about good and not bad and hurting the innocent and so on. So in that sense, Christians that are part of our military have been sometimes required to go to war. And yes, they have had to defend the country, they have had to defend themselves, they have had to perhaps kill or be killed. And so, but these are some of the principles that become important.
Thank you very much.
And so it's my turn. And again, I wanna say the tremendous amount of love that I have for these two men. I cannot say it enough and mean it enough. I have learned to truly appreciate these two men in enormous ways, and I know Rabbi is ending his time at the Temple of Emmanuel, but one of my questions to him today was, even though you won't be a rabbi there anymore, I hope you continue to meet with us. And he assured us that he would, and so I'm looking forward to that. So, Rabbi, I'd like to ask you a question which is important to me. One of the clear things that separates Judaism from Christianity is the person and work of Jesus, whom Christians believe is the expected Jewish Messiah. We believe he came from God the Father to die as God's atoning lamb in substitution for all of us who cannot please God by our own efforts and works. In the Jewish scriptures, there are a large number of prophecies about the Messiah, who he would be, what he would do, where he would be born, etc. Over 40 of them are fulfilled by Jesus and only Jesus. How do you deal with or explain away Jesus as the fulfillment of these prophecies? What makes Judaism reject them as your promised Messiah?
That's an incredible question, and one that I get quite a bit. So I've been working on this answer for a little while. So one thing that I want to kind of set the table with is what we have in common at the time that Jesus emerges as a teacher and to some as a Messiah. So going way back to about 70 Common Era, we're about to lose our second temple. At that time, there were 5 groups of Jews. there are at least 5 groups of Jews now too, so we've always had this kind of diversity. One of those groups of Jews was the Zealots. They were very angry at the Romans, as their name implies, and they fought the Romans as much as they could. There was the Essenes, which were they were kind of like our hippies, if you will. They hung out by the Dead Sea, they wrote scrolls, put them in clay jars to save them for later, and we're grateful that they did. But one of their spiritual practices was celibacy. That gets important later. There were the Sadducees, and these were the Jews who were primarily responsible for and interested in the temple service and making sure the sacrifices ran according to schedule and recipe. There were the Pharisees, who, since we lost the first temple, said, well, maybe we should not invest so much in this temple thing. Instead, we're going to read the law and discuss the law and read the Torah, and it became sort of a more scholarly expression. And then there were the Nazarenes, which were a group of Jews who had a really interesting teacher that they were studying with, who by all accounts was among the rabbis in the sense that he studied in the study halls of the Pharisees. He was much more like the rabbis than he was like any of the other groups. Now the problem is when you bother Rome tends to bring down the hammer. So first we lost the Zealots, right, because they were the ones who were fighting back. The Essenes, due to their spiritual practices, didn't last very long. That was celibacy. They weren't making new Essenes. Once we lost the temple, the Sadducees were largely out of work and dispersed. And that left the Pharisees and the Nazarenes. And so what I want to make clear is that, and the Pharisees are the ancestors to today's rabbinic Jews. And when you meet Jews on the street today, you're meeting at least one, we're not the same as the people who were in the Old Testament or in the Bible, who were sacrificing animals and talking to God on a regular basis, at least one of us at a time, like Moses or Abraham. But we've changed because we had a crisis. And this crisis was losing our primary connection to God through temple service. The Pharisees had seen that before, and so they said, we're going to keep studying. So that was one response to this crisis of losing the temple. Another response was the followers of a particular teacher. And they said, we have this scripture. We have primarily in the book of Isaiah, but another in Jeremiah and Ezekiel as well, that says, this sounds like the guy they were talking about. And the Sermon on the Mount is awesome. I'm with you on the Sermon on the Mount thing. And so we're going to follow him. So these two paths essentially came out of, there were two different responses to the same crisis of losing our connection to God. How do we stay reconnected and endure? So you have one group of people who say, we have a tradition of a Messiah that's coming, and we think we've seen him. Or we've talked to people who were close to him, and we're convinced. And you had another group of people who said, we lost the temple before, we've learned a different way to connect to God, and we're not convinced, right? And I'll tell you, whether it's two groups of Jews or just two Jews in a room, you're never going to convince both of them. Right? And so, in some of the prophecies that you talk about, I mean, we think about prophecy. Some Jews think about prophecy slightly differently, especially Isaiah, which is, I think, where most of the prophecies and quotes come from. Is that Isaiah wasn't a prophet in the sense of a fortune teller or a prognosticator saying these are the things that are going to happen. Isaiah was primarily a social critic. Right? When we were too comfortable, he said, guys, don't be so comfortable. I don't want you sacrificing animals, I want you feeding the poor. That's the fast that God requires. And when we weren't comfortable, when we were in exile and suffering, he said, it's going to be okay. It stinks now, but it's going to get better, and there will be an era of peace. There will be a time where all the swords are beaten into plowshares, and there will be a time where the whole world will acknowledge the oneness of God. And so part of our prophecies for the time of Messiah, and this is where some of the disagreement comes in, Jesus seemed to have checked a lot of boxes, but some important boxes are, we believe in our eschatology that when the Messiah comes, not only will all war end, but all tools of war will be destroyed. That that God will be universally recognized, and that we will have an era of peace. And there's some people who talk about bodily resurrection to death as well, and not just one, but all of them, or two, but all of them. And so for this group of Jews, they said, well, these particular things, it wasn't about the things that happened, it was about the things that didn't happen during the lifetime of Christ. Now, I take the tack of a colleague of mine who does a lot of interfaith work. He says, I tell you what, I'm going to keep doing my thing, and I trust you to keep doing your thing. And when the Messiah comes, I'm going to ask her, is this your first time here? And if she or he says no, you're right. But if he or she says yes, I'm right, and I'll invite you to pass over and we can thank
We both are waiting for the coming of Jesus as Messiah, so maybe we'll all end up in the same table after all.
Well, actually, if I can interject, actually, I think it's really interesting because Islamic eschatology believes in the return of Christ, and that essentially that the monotheistic religions will all recognize. We also have another character named the Mahdi who will help bring peace and bring in a new era. But it is interesting to me that it seems like in our eschatology that the faiths will actually reunite under Jesus again when he returns. So I'm hopeful for a very positive future.
And for many Christians, that is probably one of the most surprising things that what he just said. A lot of Christians have never heard that unites Islam and Christianity in that way. I have a question for you, brother, which, as you know, my dear, really, I mean that, Brother Daniel, I'm reading through the Quran, because we have discussed that little by little. I'm not jumping on the whole thing. And I appreciate that one of the things that you did is you gifted me with a book called the 40 Hadith. And I had an additional set of Hadith before that, because I've always been very interested. I'm reading through all of these very slowly, because I have at least 3 or 4 other books that I'm reading at the same time. So, you know that I'm doing this. The Quran, as well as some of the Hadith that I have read, refer to God or to the Prophet, and I don't call him Muhammad because I don't want to disrespect the name, so I'll call him the Prophet, if that's okay.
It's fine.
Okay. Okay, so both of them refer to God or the Prophet very often as the merciful or the beneficent. In fact, almost every time that either of their names is mentioned, they are called by this title or a similar one. Yet what we hear often is about Muslim fathers, for example, throwing their sons out of the family or their daughters and consider them not longer their son or daughter just because they changed religions. They may have become something else. We also hear about brothers putting to death a sister, or or binding somebody to a post and whipping them. We hear a lot of these things, and we hear of beheadings and stuff like that in many places. Are these isolated cases of radicalism? Or is this a teaching that comes from the Prophet himself? Does Islam teach to kill so-called apostates? Is this in the Quran? And how is that representative of a God or a prophet that is merciful?
So yeah, thank you so much for this question. I just point out the divine irony. When I was becoming Muslim about 9-10 years ago, I had the same question because I started going to Islamic gatherings and tasting. I was like, oh my God, Islam is so beautiful, and how come I never knew anything about this faith, you know? But then I started hearing all about all these things too, and I was like, oh my, you know, like really conflicted, because I was like, Islam is so beautiful, but what about that? That's really scary, you know? So, you know, and for the record, we had spoken to each other before this event, and he said, are you okay with that question? We can talk about this offline if you want a different question. So he was very respectful, and I said, you know, let's go for it, because I think, you know, there's an undercurrent of people who are just curious, like, what is Islam? What does it teach? So here I am, 10 years later on the stage. Now I have to ask the question. I was at a conference asking someone, what about this? And what about this verse? And what about, you know, these things? So now I get the opportunity to be the one in the hot seat, alhamdulillah. So there's a lot of questions that were kind of embedded in that, and since we have kind of a short time, I'll just focus on one in particular. But the first thing is, I got a degree in peacemaking, and in the class we had to watch a documentary. It's called Honor Diaries. So anyone who's interested in women's rights or Islamic, women's rights in Islam, it's a very interesting documentary. And what it covers is this concept of, you know, honor killings, this, you know, idea of people leaving their families or bringing shame upon a family. Long story short, the conclusion of this movie is that honor killings happen in various cultures, that this is not actually an Islamic problem. This happens in Hindu cultures, it happens in African tribes. The same thing is for the practice of female genital mutilation. That is a practice that happens. Islam gets blamed for that frequently. It's very clear from that documentary you can watch that these practices predated Islam, and they happen outside of Islam, continue today. So it's not an Islamic teaching, and it is an unfortunate thing. It does happen in Islamic countries, yes, and it is unfortunate, but it's not an Islamic teaching. Now, to answer the question about apostasy, that is a very specific thing that I can speak to, because I was like totally concerned about that too. I was like, if I become Muslim, I change my mind, am I going to get killed? You know, this is crazy. I better check first, right? So let me talk about where it comes from, because it does happen purportedly in the name of Islam, but let's talk about where it comes from. So first of all, during the time of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, very different context. It was 600 AD, very different context to today. And so the scholars, they differentiated between this idea of lesser apostasy and greater apostasy. So lesser apostasy just means that if someone became Muslim and they said, you know what, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to follow, and they choose to leave their faith, then that's considered lesser apostasy. And there's no penal code or punishment for that in the Sharia or anything like that. The Quran is very clear that people have freedom of conscience. So the Quran is constantly asking people to reflect, and is constantly bringing forth argumentation for people to ponder, why polytheism and various things like that just don't make sense. So the Quran is constantly asking people to reflect. So for example, I'll just give you a couple ayats. So first of all, Quran 2:256, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, the translation is, let there be no compulsion in religion. The truth stands out clear from error. Whoever rejects evil and believes in Allah has grasped the most trustworthy handhold that never breaks, and Allah heareth and knoweth all things. So it's very clear from this ayah that there's no compulsion in religion. So this idea of forcibly converting people to Islam is nonsense. It's not in Islam. And this is right from the Quran. I'll give you a couple other examples. It says, and say the truth is from your Lord, so whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve. There's no description of punishment, and no, anything like that. And obey Allah and obey the Messenger, be cautious, but if they turn back, then know, or if you turn back, then know that only a clear deliverance of the message is incumbent on our messenger. In other words, the Prophet's duty is to deliver the message. It's not to force people to accept, it's only to deliver. So that's the first thing. Now, where does this idea of apostasy come from? So the lesser apostasy is no crime or punishment. Now, during the time of the Prophet, ﷺ, there are hadiths that indicate that somebody should be put to death for apostasy. it's a very scary concept, people, and this is where the extremists get it from. But everything, and I'm sure these questions come up, but everything in Islam, from the Quran to the Hadith, you have to understand in its context. Everything has a context. If something sounds scary or troubling, you have to take the time to seek knowledge and understand, what does this mean? What is the context? So now keep this in mind, that during the time of the Prophet, it was one community. If you were an able-bodied man, you were expected to defend your community. The Muslims were being persecuted for 13 years, and then they suffered many different injuries under the pagan Meccans, okay? And they did nonviolent resistance for 13 years, despite being tortured, killed, boycotted, all these things. The Muslims migrated after it got to a point where it's like, this cannot continue, so the Muslims migrated to Medina, 200 miles away. But that was not enough for the pagan Meccans. They had to continue to pursue them. So they launched several full-scale assaults on the Muslims. So the Muslims formed a coalition with the people, the Jews and the others in Medina, to defend the city, and so there were battles that took place. Now what happened is, if the Muslims got the upper hand in battle, the people would surrender and say, okay, don't kill me, I'll become Muslim, But what's happening is, they were just saying that. They didn't actually mean it in their heart, right? So they would just say that, and then they would eavesdrop and spy on the Muslims, and then when they had their chance, they would flee back to Mecca and report, essentially military, information to, where the Muslims were hiding, where their, armies and camps were, and things like that. So essentially, this was an act of treason. So to apostate from Islam, the religion, and to apostate Islam from the state of Islam, that was that community at that time, were one and the same thing. So the Prophet's statement was highly contextual. He was referring to people who were actually abandoning ranks, in a sense, like in a military context. Does that make sense? So they were actually abandoning ranks and actually betraying the Muslims. So this was actually an issue. Now, this is treason. So in this context, the greater apostasy refers to someone not just leaving their faith. This is someone leaving the faith and actually actively trying to harm and create problems, and including kill the Muslim community. Does that make sense? So in that context, it was permissible to stop people, even killing them, because this was a form of treason. Now, interestingly, I looked up. In the United States, up until 1990, there was the death penalty for treason. So we look back and we think, these barbaric people, and now we look into our own country. In 1990, we had a death penalty for treason. Same thing, if you sold secrets to the Russians or you're selling military intelligence, you could be put to death here. So there's really no difference. So that is the context. Now, that being said, are there harms that happen in Muslim countries that people who don't understand or don't have a very firm grounding in their faith, do they take things out of context and have, create horrible things? Yes, it does happen. And that is a problem. But the problem actually is not inherently in the faith. The problem is people, they unfortunately are not very educated. And so all they're doing is they're not going to their scholarship, they're going to try to interpret things on their own, but they don't have the grounding or the foundational knowledge to make valid interpretations. And it's in our tradition to make any kind of authoritative comments on the Sharia. It takes 20 years of study. So far more than a conventional lawyer, so to speak. So, we have to really seek true sources of knowledge to understand these things, and because understandably they are concerning, but in my own research that I've done, all of these concerning things, they all have very understandable answers, but it's taken me 10 years actually to unearth all of these for myself, so it's very understandable that people have these questions. Hopefully that helps.
I think we've all learned a great deal. We've listened intently. I just love how you modeled conversation and certainly put a lot of things into context. And it's that listening to each other and asking the tough questions and accepting each other that really can make all the difference. So with that, I'm going to shift us into the next part, and we're going to take a few questions. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we're going to go ahead and take a few questions. But let me just start off very simply. To wrap it up with some simplicity. What do you, and three of you answer it, what do you believe the role of God today is in our society? And you can speak to it in our community, in our nation, in the world.
For the Muslim, God is the center of existence. So our entire existence is centered around God. So everything in Muslim society actually is God is at the center. It's the center of our we pray 5 times a day. So this idea that God is the central thing. The problem with modern society is that people often say they don't have time for God, and that spiritual practice, they don't have time for this stuff. But it's actually the other way around. Your job, your going to movies and these distractions are actually these things are actually the things in the way of the central purpose of human existence is to understand your connection with your Creator and to develop that connection. So that is the center of existence. And everything that we have in our life is a mirror of our relationship with God. We have a saying in Islam that God puts you where you put God. So in other words, is God, really take an honest self-assessment. Where is God on your list? Where does God come on your list? Is he number one, or is he number 3? First I gotta get my finances in order, then I really want to get that relationship, and then I'll make time for God. So the Muslim goal is to make God center and to have God be literally the access point of every decision of our life. And in the Muslim way, God is very active actually. There's different views of God. Some say God is kind of out there and just watching things as things unfold into chaos on earth. But no, we believe that prayer is very powerful, that God responds to prayer, and never to become hopeless, because God's power can change things, can affect change. And so we should always keep in mind that we should never fall into hopelessness. We should always stay hopeful that God has the power to change circumstances, and he uses human beings as that agent. And so we are honored if we can be served in that way, to be vessels in that way.
The question is very deep. It's simple, but it's not simple. So my answer would be somewhat simple, in the sense that my view of God in this world, which I think that's what the question was. It talked so long, I forgot the question.
The role of God.
The role of God.
Society.
Look, I think God is eternal. He is the creator of all things. Nothing that has ever been created is created without God. His intention is to have a relationship with that creation. I sort of want to say that what we read in the first chapters of Genesis of God and the relationship with Adam and Eve, that life in the garden which mankind, or Adam and Eve, destroyed totally, and the fall created where we're at now. I think the intent of God in this world is lovingly, because he loves us all, but is to draw us back into that relationship of intimacy with him, where we can have an intimate relationship with him, and that the wrongs we have created against each other, and that have created in nature, and have created in the world, and in all things created, can be made right. And I think God loves us. God wants a relationship with us that is real, that is intimate, that is revelatory of who he is to us and we to him. And so I think we are on this journey to be with this God, to be who this God wants us to be. The world is a mess, and I think God can make it right. And so I think he's very present. And so my view of God for this world is that God wants to draw us all into a true and full knowledge of Him and in relationship with Him.
Excellent. So I'm going to give my most Texas answer. So you didn't see my boots and my belt buckle when I came in. I am a proud son of the Republic. And I will say that for me, God's role in this world at best is as a coach. In the sense that the best coach, this is my Friday Night Lights reference, the best coach isn't somebody who just tells you what to do and gives you grief for not performing up to par. Some coaches do that. The best coach is the one who models right behavior, inspires you to be your best. And the Jewish call is to imitate God. There's a scripture that says, and we should walk in God's ways. And the rabbis ask, how do you walk in God's ways? You can't possibly fill those footsteps. And the rabbi's answer is to model God's attributes and actions. Just as God is merciful, we too should be merciful. When God is just, we too should act toward justice. And just as God clothes the naked, as God did back in that garden that one time, we too should work in this world to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, and to care for each other with mercy and compassion, as God shows us how to do.
I've got so many questions. So I have, let's see how fast we can get a few. So I've picked a few, but this one, it's for each of you. It's, again, the same question. And I think what we'll do with so many questions is I'll make sure that we kind of go through them, you all get a copy of them, and maybe there can be some follow-up somehow, some way. But I'll make sure that you all get those questions. So for each of you, if we can do this quickly. Have you each learned something new about each other that you haven't learned in your previous discussions with each other? Meaning, has this moment provided some new insight about one another? You can go ahead, Father.
Well, I certainly have learned a lot, and one of the things I have learned is how little I know. One of the reasons that, I said yes to David as far as getting together with Rabbi and with Daniel, really not knowing where all of this was going to take us. But I have learned to love both of them, truly with a good intention and good heart. I have continued to learn a lot. Of course, I'm much more familiar with Judaism because it is the root of Christianity. But because I've known so little about Islam, so I'm taking the task of actually reading the Quran, the Hadith, doing research, asking your questions. And I have learned some things from David that I was taught from Daniel, that I was completely ignorant about some of the things we actually do have in common in our faith that before I had no idea whatsoever. And I look forward to learning a whole lot more from my brother Daniel and from Rabbi. I think I know Judaism. I know nothing about Judaism. So I'm actually, Rabbi was talking about earlier that he's got several classes going. I'm saying, how do I sign up for one of them? So I'm looking forward to learning much more from both of them.
I'll just go real quick because I can smell the food too. So I think I've learned something that on the one hand, I hope everyone else here learns too, but on the other hand, I've got a little bit deeper contact with both of you gentlemen. What I'm really proud of today is, as he said, we have asked harder questions to each other today than we've asked for a year over Huevos Rancheros and Hill Street Back. And we were able to do that because we've been able to build this relationship of trust. And at the end of this, and this is what I hope you see, is that we have asked the hardest questions of each other that we could come up with. and we're walking out of here friends.
Amen.
And we haven't necessarily changed each other's minds about our respective faiths. We've contributed to understanding, and now we are even stronger when it comes to facing the problems out in the world that we all share in common. So that's what I learned today. This works, and God willing, everyone else here will see that this works and continues to engage in this kind of conversation.
Yeah, I think for me, I just I look out in the world today and I see so many people that are missing their connection with God or their higher power or spirituality. I see there's a lot of a spiritual drought, so to speak. And so when I look at my friends and brothers up here, I think I truly consider them my brothers in God. And our theological distinctions don't get in the way of that at all. And I feel very much at ease and just comfortable with you guys, and I just enjoy your presence and your wisdom. And I really feel, to me, the bigger, I don't want to say battle, that sounds a little too intense, but I think that people of faith in general have so much in common, and that there's so much spiritual drought, like I was saying out there, that I just feel at home with people of faith in general. I feel really at home with people of faith, and I'm just grateful for people who want to bring that light into other people's life who are lacking it. So I very much see you guys as my allies in that greater journey.
One of the first questions we asked each other when we were beginning to get together and know one another, do you remember one of the questions I asked is, if anyone ever stands up to abuse you in any way, would the rest of you defend the other? And we said, definitely so. I would not allow anyone to offend or hurt either of these two men, and I'd just be sitting down and doing nothing. And that's just not going to happen. That's just the level of love and respect that I have for these two men, and I would stand with them anytime, any place. Even with our differences, I will stand with these two men.
So I made a judgment call in extending the panel, because I think it was important for us to listen and to learn so that we may all better understand. So I'm going to take this one last question, and then I think it can transition us very well. And this is a pretty powerful question. What's your reflection of love to the communities that you serve? Of love, your reflection of love. So give a message of love to the communities you serve. What does it mean?
Well, I would begin by saying that God is love. In fact, that's something that the New Testament tells us, that God is love. And in fact, it says that if you cannot love, you don't know God. And so the concept of love, St. Paul wrote a letter to a church called Corinth, and in one of those chapters is what we call the chapter of love, and he describes love from the point of view really of who God is and how we ought to imitate that in loving one another. And love is not selfish, love is not it doesn't condemn, it doesn't hurt another person. I mean, there's a whole array of his description of what love is. But if I were gonna, answer that question, the way I would answer is that God is love, and unless you love like God loves you, you don't have God. If you can hurt another human being, God is not in you. I don't care what's in your head or how many scriptures you can quote. If you cannot love, you don't know God.
Thank you.
one of the things I really respect about the Christian tradition is that love is kind of a very central theme that you see. And I think, unfortunately, that is very much true in Islam as well, but it doesn't, unfortunately, get as much focus, but it depends on who your teacher is. The teacher I came to Islam with, that was his central focus. About every time we met, he'd say 5 things, that Islam is peace, love, mercy, justice, and freedom. He said, that is, you understand that? That's Islam. And, but very much in the context of Islam, it's very much there. And so I very much believe that in that sense, the Muslim community can learn from the Christian community in terms of the way that they put that at the foremost. The prophet, peace be upon him, there's a name that God gives to every prophet. So, for example, Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was named Abraham. He was Khalilullah, he was the friend of God. Moses was Kalamullah, the one who spoke to God. Jesus is Ruhullah, the Spirit of God. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Habibullah, he's the love of God. So actually, central to the teaching of Islam is to enter into a relationship with God through love, through following the Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, follow me and Allah will love you. So the entire existence, the entire path of Islam really is love, is that we emulate our teacher, in your case Jesus, peace be upon him, in my case Muhammad and all the prophets, we emulate them because their example is what is beloved in the example of conduct to God. That is what pleases God. And we too become the beloveds of God through adhering to that conduct and following in that way. And I'll end by saying the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, no one truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And it's very clear, the scholars say that doesn't mean your Muslim brother. That means the brother of humanity. So, inshallah, we can come back to this central teaching of love in our faith as well.
And not because I have any lack of love, but just to contain it in a vessel. I think my expression would be in my community and for all the community here goes back to a time of crisis. We were talking about the destruction of the temple, and there's a story about 2 rabbis, a student and a teacher walking outside of Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple, and the student, Rabbi Yehoshua, sees the temple ruins. And is broken-hearted. And he's like, game over, man. Like, how can we endure when the structures and the ritual and the organization and our way of understanding the world has been cut off from us, that we can't do sacrifices anymore? I thought that's the only way we talked about it, right? And his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, said, Vinny, my son, don't despair. Because we have a text, we have a teaching from the prophet Hosea that says what God wants is not sacrifices, but chesed, loving kindness, which is slightly different from love as the feeling, but chesed, the Jewish word for kindness, implies more, it's loving kindness is the best translation, but it's love in action. And so if we look out in a world that seems broken, if our old ways of doing things don't necessarily fit our new needs or the new people that have those needs, we don't need to despair, because the point of all of this is love in action and supporting one another within our communities and within throughout the world. And if we can do that, that's what makes God smile.
That concludes the question. But please, the conversation, although you've asked questions that didn't get answered, remember, talk to each other. Continue this conversation with one another. There are many different faiths represented here. So I hope you will continue those conversations. So here we've witnessed something extraordinary. They have modeled the ideal with so much going on in the world and in our nation and even in our communities. They have modeled what it will take for us to change the world. And remember, Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, because it's the only thing that ever has. So this afternoon, we celebrate our freedom of being able to have this conversation, to share with one another our differences. But that has not happened historically. So what I'd like us to do right now is just to take a moment of silence and remember all those who have suffered and died and been persecuted because of their faith. So I ask that we just take a moment to reflect on that. Thank you. Let me conclude that moment by saying something by Howard Thurman. I cannot be at peace without God and not truly aware of God if not at peace with my brothers and sisters. So with that, before we figure out how to get to the buffet table, I would like to ask, do a couple more introductions. We have someone very special with us this evening, and that's Dorothy Greenstein. She's back in the corner. Each year, the very program that has brought us together is the Days of Remembrance. And every year, Dorothy has come and spoken to the students, and this year she was featured in the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She is a survivor of the Holocaust. We are so grateful that you are here with us, Dorothy. And I'm also pleased that our Vice Mayor is with us, Sharon Springer. And I need to introduce the President of the Burbank Human Relations Council, Mike Chapman, who is somewhere around here. And before we leave, Mike will indeed make a few announcements and acknowledgments. And with that, let's see how we're going to do. I think it might be easier to do the front. Well, let's do it in rows. Let's do this row first to the buffet, and then we'll go work the room this way. It's the only way I can figure to do it. That way, you're not all going at once. So let's start here and move this way to the buffet table, and we'll see if we can get through dinner fairly quickly. And remember, to continue the conversation, you don't necessarily have to return to the, well, maybe you do now that we have to do it that way. But I'd love for one of you to talk to someone you don't know. So in that buffet line, please strike up a conversation. And thank you all for being here. It has been truly an extraordinary evening. We can change the world. So with that, let's go.
There's an intention going toward the buffet line. Now, all of us are here because of a covenant that started with one person and her husband Abraham. That started with Abraham and God, and they made a deal. You be my Abraham, I'll be your God. And I said, okay, and the rest is history, literally. We also said at the beginning, look, if you want my people to show up, there better be food. So we've got food. So here's the covenant I'd like to suggest. Here's the deal. We're feeding you dinner. Now, if you didn't get your question, this is your side. If you didn't get your question answered up here, I want you to take your question and ask it to somebody here tonight. Because when we started this, we weren't like, this is a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim. This is not Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with like a scoreboard behind us. We came here as individuals to have this conversation. So I believe that somebody at your table, and everybody at your table, is qualified to answer the questions that you have for us. So grab something to eat, come back, and open up a conversation at your table.
Great.
Hero, once again, really thank you so much for listening to the Jewcurious show, for listening to this episode in particular. This was actually a really important and meaningful event for me, and all the more so important for me to share with you. If you want to check out the show notes for this episode with links to some references that I talked about, please go to jewcurious.show/episode 9. That's the word episode with the number 9 after it. Check that out. And while you're there, make sure you scroll down to the big gold button or whatever color you see it in. It's a big button with a little picture of a calendar on it, and click to join the 31-day Fall Jewish Holiday Learning Challenge. I can't believe how bananas this is right now. There's already over 60 people joining it, but just like this show, just like the Jewish people, there's always room for one more. There's always room for you. Until next time, hero, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Jewcurious Show at www.jewcurious.show.